Welcome to the Magnificast. I'm Dean.
And I'm Matt.
So this week we're talking with Derek Ford, again, who we talked to a long time ago in episode 3. But before we do that, a little podcast housekeeping would help. So the first order of business, the Virillia reading group that we're going to do is still going to happen, and it starts on July 11th. So there's details at our blog, and you can also sign up at our Patreon account, or just drop us a couple of bucks for no reason, to improve our sound audio quality, which really just, helps you in the end.
The more money you give us, the better the sound quality gets.
That's right. Second, we started a Facebook group so we can all get to know each other and build a revolution on the internet. So it's very fun to kind of chat. And also Matt and I met on a subreddit one time. So we're bringing back all the greatest hits. And then lastly, please rate us on iTunes. Apparently, according to some podcast entrepreneurs that Matt and I read for fun.
It's not fun.
And not for profit. Apparently, that's a very important thing to do. So yeah, who knows? They might be right. Give us your very, very lots of starred reviews.
Speaking of lots of starred reviews, we've been asking people to do this for I don't know, all of the episodes forever. And there are 3 reviews, and I want to take a second just to give a shout out to the people who have reviewed us. First of all, there's someone named Matt Aaron Robertson, who says, "This podcast is a gem, 5 stars." He's right, it is. There is someone called Dude Ravioli who says, "Now that's a podcast." Okay, that one was me. That was actually just me doing it. But I'm right. It is what I call a podcast. That's sort of a review that could be positive or negative, or just stating that is a true statement. Affirmative.
The ravioli.
Yeah,
statement.
That's right. Affirmative. And then most recently, shout out to BB Hillard, who gave us a paragraph review, which is, more effort than I could ever expect anyone to give for this podcast or also iTunes. He gave us a 4 out of 5 stars, which is very appropriate. And he says these things about the podcast. And I appreciate all of them, and they're all 100% true. He says, BB Hillard. I don't know what BB stands for, but we'll speculate.
Big Boss.
Big Boss Hillard. That's his new name. Sorry, or her new name. I don't know. Big Boss Hillard says, "This podcast caught my attention first via Twitter, where the 2 hosts are avid posters." That's right, we are. The first few episodes of this podcast are painfully poor-leveled, making for a rough experience as one voice is remarkably loud and the other is absurdly quiet. In addition, the first several episodes are filled with a few awkward pauses and a general lack of direction, with some baseline hot tactics.
Yeah,
so
right.
This is 100% true. And I'm not offended or mad. I just this is absolutely the truth. That's what the first few episodes are like. But a few episodes in, this podcast becomes its own. The episode on Virilio grabbed my attention and kept me coming back. The 2 hosts are extremely talented in speaking and playing off each other quite well. Not to mention, they are well read and well trained in the act of hot takes. That's actually what my master's degree is in hot takes.
Yeah, I go to a hot take dojo every morning, actually.
It's the Hot Take Dojo is better than Hot Takes University. It's more intensive training, one-on-one exercise,
Yeah, that's right.
The most recent episode I thought was the best so far. Big Boss Hiller does not tell us what that is. This is supposed to be June 9th, so maybe the last episode.
The best part is, as the review ages, every episode will be the best one. So I appreciate that. I'm thankful for that.
They will all be the best. Anyways, the most recent episode I thought was the best so far and left me wanting more. I'm not even Catholic. I'm a non-practicing Southern Baptist. But this podcast has revitalized both my faith and leftist belief. After a rough start, this podcast is settling into a very interesting niche, which is surprisingly dope. This is the most edifying and great, just the best thing I've ever read. It makes me feel like what we're doing actually matters. And it's that it revitalizes faith is the most interesting thing to me, because it's kind of we're doing evangelism here. So local mission committees out there, local mission committee members, please consider us for your donations of money.
Tell your youth pastors.
Yeah, tell your youth pastors.
Hold a good communist potluck at your church. We know that it will get people in the door now. This is a tried and true method.
Yeah, that's right.
It works.
A love offering for this podcast specifically. Yeah, okay, so thanks, Big Boss Hillard. We appreciate you and your 4 stars and all of your very honest feedback. Honestly, like, so floored that somebody said all of those nice things. Very cool. Okay, so we want to talk with Derek Ford again. We took a poll not too long ago about like the most popular episodes, and the episode 3, I think, was when we first talked to Derek, and everyone voted that they wanted more. So we're gonna follow the tradition of Democratic Twitter centralism and and give the people what they want. I don't know. So we're doing it. Derek's back on the podcast. And we picked some stuff to read with him and kind of get his input on. So first we picked a relatively leftist Christian, Herbert McCabe, and also some essays from Lenin on religion and socialism. So in this episode, we're going to juxtapose how each treats religion. The point of this discussion is to make more bridges between Christian thought and communist practice, and Christian practice and communist thought. Yeah. That's what we're doing. So if you didn't hear the first episode with Derek, Derek wrote a book called Communist Study, and it's very cool. He writes a lot about Althusser and lots of other people. He is a member of the PSL. He's a professor. He's awesome. He's very cool. He just got married. Congrats. Let's see. So that's Derek, if you don't know who he is. If you don't know who Herbert McCabe is, he was a Dominican priest who contributed some pretty famous leftist Catholic journals. And if you don't know who Lenin is, I don't know, man. Like, what are you doing here?
It's been 100 years since you should know.
Yeah, right. You just Google him, I guess. First, we're going to talk about Lenin and religion, and then we're going to kind of segue into talking about McCabe. But first, let's catch up a little bit. Okay, cool. Well, Derek, thanks for coming back to talk to us. We appreciate that. It was the first episode was so good we had to do it again.
Let's do the exact same thing.
That's the exact same episode. I have the script here.
Yeah.
That's good. Also, congrats on getting married. That's awesome.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Being married is very fun. I like that a lot.
What does a communist wedding look like? Do you guys have a communist priest who comes and reads from the communist Book of Common Communist Prayer?
No, we had a reverend from the church where my partner Sarah and I went pretty much since we started living together. I've known him for about 8 years. A church in Syracuse called Do It Community Church, and we had readings from the Bible, and we also had readings from Badu.
Oh my God,
he was our communist.
That's so
there.
Good.
And it was funny. So, obviously, many of the people invited were communists. And, I would just say, for anyone having a wedding, definitely invite communists because they will just make sure, that everything happens because they're such good organizers. So, they were... 2 of my comrades were in charge of, giving people, the wedding programs as they entered. And they were just, they were about to hit the streets afterwards because they were we got more. We got to get rid of them. We can't go back to Derek with these flyers. We gotta go to the masses. It was funny.
You got to rent these services out. That sounds like a good way to build money for the party.
Honestly, it is. I mean, well, the thing is there are. I mean, disciplined organizations actually have done that. So with the Nation of Islam, has the Fruits of Islam, and they actually they provided security for a lot of housing projects up until Clinton gutted HUD funding in the 1990s. They were they were the ones who would regulate.
That's awesome.
Yeah, interesting.
On a related note, thing that I did this weekend, on Saturday, I went to a karaoke party hosted by the Communist Party of Canada. It was, it wasn't as well organized as a wedding. but it was very well organized and very fun. Mostly like songs in like I don't know, Greek and Spanish, and then like a few of my like younger friends came to just sing like indie rock, so that was cool. My wife sang. She's a lot braver than I am. I did not sing. I just drank, so that was fun.
That's cool. It's interesting that there's more than just the Internationale over and over again at that party.
That's right.
Neat. I didn't do anything exciting. I just argued with people on Twitter and
Good.
Lost my mind about Jeremy Corbyn, and like that was it. That was all I
did. That's important.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that's important.
All right. Do you want to just move on a little bit to the essays that we read for today?
Okay, yeah, so we picked 2 essays from Lenin to read about religion. One's called Socialism and Religion, and the other one is called The Attitude of the Workers' Party to Religion. And I think they both express about like the same sort of sentiment. And mainly what Lenin thinks about religion is that it's best kept as sort of a private matter, which is, I think, a pretty good strategic move. But maybe before we even get that far, Derek, I don't know, do you want to tell us about like Lenin for a minute, or like why he's a character we should care about?
Yeah, well, I mean, so Lenin, I think one of the reasons why he's, so widely read, so widely cited is because he was the, not only the sort of, leader of the Russian Revolution and the person who made it, like the sort of, theorist and strategist who made it not just a blip, right? Not just sort of a brief experiment.
Right.
But, as one who was able to actually make it sort of take hold for, and last and endure. And I think that not just in Russia, but his sort of, his translation of Marxism into the era of imperialism was, I think, the sort of, it was the thing, I don't know, it's sort of, I would say, a fulcrum in the global, like, revolutionary surge of the 20th century. One of the things that really made the 20th century, possible, like, it was the key sort of theoretical, he was provided the key, like, theoretical link for the coming together of movements for socialism and for national liberation. And so even those struggles that were waged that weren't of an explicitly socialist character, throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, were like influenced by Lenin, by his writing, by his thinking, and the way that he was able to sort of read and navigate the tumultuous, decades before 1917 and, sometime after that. I don't know. That's what I think. What do you think?
I like what you said too. I mean, about how, I don't know, Lenin is the guy that sort of like makes this work for like the 20th century, and also in terms of like imperialism and thinking about imperialism. Dean and I have been talking a lot about, like, alternating between like Twitter and Facebook, talking a lot about the sort of ongoing struggle of the Communist Party of the Philippines, which has some like Maoist, like Marxist-Leninist Maoist stuff going on it. And what I've learned with that, and along with some Marxist-Leninist stuff too, is that like those modes of critique and modes of struggle aren't like reducible to just like the figures of Lenin or figures of Mao, that they're like, stretched over geography and different locations and like deployed all kinds of different places. So that's what I found really interesting about Lenin, is that it's not just like about the dude himself, but it's about the way that sort of plays out everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think that's like a really helpful way into talking about Lenin as a figure. Do you want to talk a little bit about why writing on religion at all would matter for somebody in Lenin's Russia in particular? Well,
yeah. So I think that looking at, so Russia at the time of, in a lot of Europe, at the, late 19th century, early 20th century, the church is a fundamental feature of society. And, even like, this is after the Enlightenment and all that, right? But still, I mean, especially in Russia, basically Lenin positions the church as a sort of intermediary between the state and the people. The church is dependent on the state. It tries to keep the people dependent on it, and it's dependent on the state. And he talks about, in one of the pieces that we read in 1905, he talks about it as like, basically it has like a sort of feudal position in relation to the state. And yeah, so it's like a critical, like, material element. It's also an important, he's very concerned about it, and communists are concerned about it because of the way in which it's able to paper over the class struggle or sort of redirect the class struggle around other ends. And like, yeah, and sort of obscure the idea that class struggle is a fundamental antagonism in society.
Yeah, I think that's great, and it's like a really good way into what's going on in Lenin's own thoughts about religion. So, Matt, I wonder, like, was there anything that struck you in either of these two essays in particular that, like, just jumped out as a religious person thinking about Leninism?
Yeah. Okay. So there's, like, some stuff that I don't know, strikes me as a little condescending, and some stuff that strikes me as like strategically helpful, though, regardless of the condescension. There's this, like, in both of these essays from Lenin, there's like this overall feeling that this really interesting sort of play. Okay, on the one hand, he basically says, like, every socialist, or at least everyone that subscribes to materialism, every socialist that subscribes to materialism will be like an atheist by rule, because there's, like, no room for that in any sort of, like, religious worldview. And that seems disingenuous, but also he's writing at a time before, like, so much theology ever happened. So, I mean, I guess I can't blame him. But it's just, like, it's funny to me that he just takes it up, like, as a rule, all socialists will have to be atheists because of materialism. Which kind of discounts a lot of, like, the radical theology of the church, but at the same time I get it. Anyways, like, that's the sort of condescending part that, like, I had a hard time with, but I kind of understand it in historical context. But the part that I do like that's cool. There's a quote from Socialism and Religion, and I'll just read it here if that's cool.
Yeah.
Lenin says, "Unity in this really revolutionary struggle of the oppressed class for the creation of a paradise on earth is more important to us than unity of proletarian opinion on paradise in heaven." That, like, overall feeling of, like, the unity of, like, the proletariat is very cool and very good. And, maybe he doesn't, Lenin doesn't have super nuanced views on theology, and, like, that is totally okay. But even though he doesn't, there's room sort of for everybody, regardless of, like, their brand of metaphysical belief.
Yeah, I like, too, that it kind of cuts against that stereotype of communism that you get fed in the West, that, like, there's this kind of massive groupthink and nobody's allowed to think for themselves or ever care about anything. And Lenin's like, I just don't care what you think about, if you're, like, a Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, like, just, maybe don't exploit labor. Like, that would be a better thing.
Yeah, talk about, like, religious liberty,
Yeah.
yeah. And the thing is, I mean, I agree that there's, he has this, like, hard and fast view, right? The materialism over here, God, Christianity, whatever, theology over here. But the interesting thing is this sort of, like, is that, he doesn't say that, like, after the revolution or under socialism, everyone will be atheist, right? His position is that, like, the party is atheist because, and this is a condescension, obviously, but they're the advanced sections, right?
That's
but
a
it's
good
not like
distinction.
But it's like, yeah, so they have to be atheists. But in a socialist society, not everyone might be socialists.
Right.
And so, thus not everyone will be atheists.
Yeah, could we talk about that distinction a little bit between what Lenin thinks you should, commit to as a person who's a member of the party, and then commit to as a person who's a member of, like, the struggle? Because, I guess there are a few places in the essays where he makes concessions to, like, clergy people who are radicalizing, or, he'll say, like, yeah, somebody can join the party and think whatever they want about religion. Like, we don't ask because we don't care. But then at other points in times, he's like, but also, like, you should care a little bit.
I think Lenin's views on religion are basically just contradictory, And I think that because he is like, the sort of overarching theme, I think, is always that it's secondary. It's not a primary thing, right? So just, like, don't stop, like, writing about it because it's just weird and alienating. And he says that it's, it's not just, he says that this isn't just like a strategic thing. Like, it's not just because it's alienating, but it's also because, like, it contradicts Marxism to think that any propagandizing against religion, really does anything, because people, right, and go through this transition we're supposed to go through, where we go, he says, from clergymen or parishioners or whatever into proper socialists that are atheists, happens not because anyone reveals something to us, but because our experience in the struggle leads us to this belief and these convictions and this consciousness. So again, it's like material reality determining consciousness. Mm-hmm. So it's not just like, he isn't just saying, like, well, just don't talk about it because, like, we're trying to win this other thing over here. But it is like, but I think that's the primary takeaway, right? Is that it is like a sort of secondary thing, and right, it's like never primary, and he can't really think of a situation where it would be a priority or a primary contradiction to attend to. But on the other hand, he says that, right, the party, like, religion is a private affair in relation to the state, but in relation to the party, they have to be concerned with it. So, he always, like, one of the good things about Lenin, I think, in terms of, like, reading him, is not only is he, like, super clear, right? Mm-hmm. And just as an aside, like, I remember I was reading, I think it was, like, Imperialism with a group of people, and my friend Ben was like, I just love how, like, clear this is and how much sense it makes. And he was like, and then I realized, like, oh yeah, because they won, right? There's this relationship between the fact that, like, reading Lenin, you're like, oh yes, this is super clear. Like, there's no, like, like what we see in academic texts all the time, which is like this sort of ending where it's like, oh, all these different tensions, and we should let them play out, and, like, we should not reduce one, and you know what I mean, like, yeah, blah blah blah, which is basically just like a refusal to take a position. Lenin's always like, no, there's this position, there's this position, there's this position, and this is the right position for this reason. And I think that, like, that's not unrelated to the fact that they actually won. But anyways, so he says that, like, there's this sort of, right, like, left opportunism, which would be, or left, not opportunism, but left deviation, which is, like, to rail against the, to be, like, public atheists and to, propagandize against religion. And then there's this right opportunism, which is, or right deviation, which is, okay, because religion's a private affair, like, we just don't say anything about it, and, you don't even address it. And then, so he's trying to, like, walk this line in between those two things. And, to the extent, and I think that, like, the history, I'm not an expert on, like, religion in the Soviet Union, right? But I would say, and if I, you both probably know more about this than I do, but I would say that the history of the Soviet Union plays out this sort of, right, ambiguous, like, walking this line and taking a clear position, but it's still, like, there's still a lot to be worked out.
Yeah, it's hard to say. The Soviet Union's relationship to the Orthodox Church is really complicated and weird. And I think, like, I don't know, from my vantage point, it doesn't seem as though Lenin's kind of a chilled out view about religion kind of won out, which is unfortunate, but, like, I don't blame him for that per se, given that he says what he says here. But what I think is really strategically fascinating in this article is, the two things that I really appreciated, as you were talking, Derek, about, they won. I was just thinking about why that is, and one of the strategic things that really helped, I think, is saying we shouldn't go after religion because it just gets all these kind of bourgeois concerns going and roiling, and it just distracts from the actual important questions that people should be dealing with. So, the minute that communists get vilified as atheists, then like nobody's interested anymore, and that's like bad news. And it doesn't really matter, like you were saying, it's a secondary issue. So like just don't deal with it. And then I loved also the second point where he's arguing with the anarchists, and he's like, anarchists say, they accuse Marxists of just not trying to scare away religious people. And Lenin's like, well, it's more than that, but also, like, why would you want to scare away religious people? I just, like, really appreciated that. Okay, so Lenin thinks that, religion should be a private affair and that the Advanced Socialist Party, everybody in that is an atheist. However, I wonder if the Herbert McCabe article that we read kind of problematizes this a little bit, because McCabe clearly has a understanding of class struggle, and he's trying to work that out for Christians and as a Christian. And I think, I don't know, I mean, if you're like a hardline atheist, I guess that you would still say McCabe is, delusional, and maybe like in a future social society he would get over that hump. But as a Dominican priest, thinking through what class struggle means, I do think that it kind of just pushes Lenin a little bit on this. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Derek, what did you think about that essay?
I mean, so reading it, and this is the class struggle in Christian love, it's clear that it's like the primary audience, right, is definitely not. It's interesting because it's almost like, whereas Lenin is talking to Marxists about how to approach Christians, and saying, or whatever, how to deal with religion, the question of religion, and saying it's like, well, this is a secondary thing. It's almost like McCabe is talking to Christians about their relationship to Marxism and whatever struggles for liberation and emancipation, and he's not saying, I don't know, he's trying to say hold both like Christian love and class struggle as congruous or in some sort of harmony, or like, mutually reinforcing or whatever. And I think, so reading it, I don't read it, I don't know, as like, I feel like he's not trying to win me over.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a good, I don't know. I think that if I were to be a Christian person, it's basically, so Lenin says, right, like that we should push clergymen, and we should say like, okay, so you say that you're for freedom, and you're for justice, and you're for, the last shall come first, right? And so we should just push clergymen and say like, okay, well, if you really believe that, then what are you going to do about it? What's your position on this, right? How can we have, 8 people who have as much wealth as 50% of the world's population? And I see this as kind of taking the same line, basically saying like, okay, well, like, if you say that, like you should love, love others and do, do justice and things like that, then what does that really mean in practice? And then just trying to work out the contradiction between love and struggle. I don't know. I appreciate the way that he, the thing is really is, what is love? And is love, at one point he says that love doesn't have its own interests. I don't know what that means. Maybe you all can shed light on that for me. But the interesting thing is that I think what I get from this, from my reading, is that love and harm are not at all like mutually exclusive, right? So like to love one doesn't mean that you will not refrain from harming one, right? Or refrain from like repressing one. It's kind of like in education, people talk about Paulo Freire. He wrote this book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Very few people read it. It's decent. And at one of the key points in there, though, is he says that like sometimes he says it's an act of love to repress the oppressor, right? To prevent the oppressor from oppressing, to restrain them or to repress them in that way is actually a love, and that's a process of humanizing them. So like the gulag, right, would be like a humanizing institution where you would be like loving the oppressor.
Yeah, I think like it's interesting because so in Western Christian societies, Christians are like very nervous about just violence in general, except like as we talked about on the other episode, very bad systemic violence like capitalism or imperialism. Like that's something that Christians don't often worry about. Right. But when it comes to like bodies like meeting other bodies in space, like that's a problem for Christians. And I think it's really interesting that McCabe is trying to cut across that a little bit and deal with those hard questions like, if someone is, totally ruining your planet and other people, then it may be an act of love for them, for their own good to like not let them destroy the only planet that we have. Like he has some sort of general like points for his view of class struggle, and one of them is that it's not about envy or resentment of like the rich, and I thought like that was such a good thing to kind of push against. Like it's not as though people who are engaged in class struggle just like want to be on top and want all the stuff. It's like motivated by this kind of very different solidarity that has nothing to do with that question.
To get back at some of what Derek was saying, I guess, in the beginning of his thoughts there, or like that this is an essay not for like communists to come to church or something, but more about like for Christians to think more about like understanding material conditions and also understanding the discourse of communism and the left a little bit more. There's a really good quote, I think, from the McCabe essay that is worth parsing out here because I think it kind of applies to the situation. And it applies to the stuff that Lenin was saying as well. McCabe, he says, Christianity is not an ideal theory, it is a praxis, a particular kind of practical challenge to the world. Christians therefore do not or should not stand around saying, what a pity there is capitalism and the class war. They say, or they should say, how are we going to change this? That idea, I think, is pretty, important for this discussion because Christianity is about practicing certain things, but it is lacking a real critical and theoretical element in a lot of ways. Like it doesn't understand class war like within itself, right? It doesn't have that capacity. And asking Christians to think about the ways that leftists and communists have like thought about class struggle and materialist histories, I think is a real opening point for this like larger question of Christian practice, and like what love looks like in some of those places. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I really like that when you said that Christianity is a praxis, because to me that's really like that's what Lenin is saying to the militant atheists, right? Is he's like, this is a praxis. This is something that you do. This isn't something that you polemicize against in newspapers and you talk about in the realm of ideas. This is something that like only exists insofar as it manifests itself in the actual world and that it corresponds to the like sort of contemporary configurations or coordinates of society and of the class struggle. And to me, that's kind of what McCabe is saying.
Yeah,
but just about Christianity.
So bringing that full circle then to what we were saying about repression and love, and about how maybe enacting Christian love in some places means like repressing other social forces like capitalism. The thing, Derek, the thing you said about gulags makes me very uncomfortable because I don't know what to do with that. But like the central idea is there, I guess, like that to enact a Christian practice through a theory, through Marxist theory or through Marxist Leninism or something, looks different than just Christian practice by itself. There's a larger and more systemic direction you can put that practice into, and I think that is very helpful. There are current historical situations that Marx himself can't talk about because he's not here, and there are tons more of historical present political situations that I don't know, Jesus and the saints and can't talk about because they're not here. So finding ways to extend Christian practice through better theory seems really important.
Yeah, I think so. Actually, this might be an interesting time to ask you, Derek, a little bit about your experience in the PSL, a Marxist-Leninist party trying to do real-life stuff in the world, and not just reading books. Like, do you meet a lot of Christians in the party per se, or do you guys have a kind of a good Leninist principle that you just don't talk about it? Like, you talk about it over beers, but not at party meetings. Like, how does it seem to operate in, like, a place like the United States, which is sort of notorious for having a lot of very reactionary Christians?
Yeah. Well, I think that, like, where we are right now, the church is, in general, like, it's not, I don't know, like, a lot of people go to church, right? It's relevant, but, if you talk to any, like, pastor or reverend, right, like, any young one who's just coming in, what they're saying is, like, nobody goes to church anymore, right? And, I mean, is that true?
Yeah,
that's
that it's
right.
like there's been, like, rapid decline in church attendance and young people, right? Congregations are getting older. Is that true?
Yeah, and there's a gazillion, Christian think pieces about why millennials aren't going to church or whatever.
Right, yes, yeah.
It's because there's not enough communism in church, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's because they need to do more memes, I think.
More memes, that's right.
More memes.
Oh, God.
So it's a totally different situation in which there is, like, the, religious right wing, that we have to, like, that we fight against. But when we fight against them, we're clear that this isn't about, right? This isn't a fight against Christianity. This is, a fight against this, whatever, like a perversion of it, or like a political manifestation of it, in the same way that, like, we will condemn the, like, Salafist, jihadist terrorist groups, like Daesh, Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, all those types of groups, without, like, saying that, like, the masses have to denounce Islam, right? And just, so it's like, I mean, in terms of individuals and their beliefs, I think that, like, I mean, I think that, like, it's not a primary struggle. And so, like, people who have religious beliefs, are comfortable to share them. And some people, like, wear visual symbols that communicate that. And, I mean, we take pride in that. Like a communist party is supposed to represent the composition of the proletariat. And so, like, in that sense, actually, if your communist party is all atheists, you don't represent the composition of the proletariat today at all, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, this isn't like a line that we have, or, like, we don't have, like, if you read our publications, it's not like we have an official position on religion in the same way that, we don't have an official position on, like, hairstyles or dress or whatever. And not to, I mean, I don't mean that in a, disparaging way, like that, like, religion is just something you put on in the morning or something like that. But just to say that, like, we also don't have a hard position or a position on, let's say, like, I don't know, what the primary form of capital today is. Like, is it finance capital or is it industrial capital? You know what I mean? Like, like, are important questions for sure, right? But we don't have a position on it. Like, we have diversity of views within our party on those topics. And yeah, so I think that's, like, we want to condemn, like, Islamophobes, all anti-Muslim sentiment. We want to condemn the sort of religious right wing. If there's a group that's being oppressed because of their religious practices, we want to defend them. And their ability, their right to do that. We think that people should have the right to worship, how they want to worship, in society, and to be, to not be afraid to do that, to not have to face, like, terrorist violence in order to do that.
Yeah, that's really fascinating to me. So Matt was saying earlier, like, we're kind of obsessed with the Communist Party of the Philippines right now. It's the flavor of the month over here at the Magnificast. And, one very cool thing about them that I would like to get your thoughts on, especially having read the McCabe and Lenin together, is so in the CPP, there is another group called the CNL, the Christians for National Liberation. And to make a very long story short, they're just like a bunch of Christians who are very into communism. So they're part of the armed struggle in the Philippines, and they like put out their own communiques, but like sort of within the umbrella of the CPP. And like the Philippines is something like 90% Roman Catholic, and then like a slightly smaller percent, or significantly smaller percent, Protestant and whatever. Basically everyone is a Christian. And so it's really interesting because like the way the armed struggle has taken up Christian language has intentionally tried to like convert priests and nuns in particular, but also lay people and bishops and whatever, understanding that there's like not only like a real social capital in doing that, but also like there's a real kind of driving force to be had in languages like Christianity and other sort of religious vocabularies. And I was thinking about like at the end of the McCabe essay, he talks about, he has this great thing about the Sermon on the Mount. And he's like, so people think the Sermon on the Mount would like mean you have to be a pacifist, but what if it actually just trains you to be a really good comrade? So like, instead of being, like people don't want to be around like arrogant jerks. And so Jesus is like, yeah, that's why you should be meek and humble, because that's how you build solidarity, right? But that doesn't preclude these other kinds of actions. So do you think that, there's room in like a kind of Leninist program to, not just be completely silent about religion, and also not like totally endorse a religion, but kind of intentionally borrow from those traditions in the way that it borrows from other kinds of Marxist language or philosophical language or tools, etc.?
Yeah, I think that, one thing is that, the function of the Communist Party, right, is to, it exists to like lead, wage, win, contribute to, maximize the struggle against capitalism and imperialism, right? And the whole reason for the party form, as Lenin conceptualized it, and as it has succeeded in the world, is that it's like, it's the most effective, efficient, sort of congruous way in which to accomplish that task, right? So, like, democratic centralism is not just this principle that like Lenin loves. He says that it just makes the most sense right now, and like we don't have a fetish for it. It's just like centralization, discipline, those types of things are necessary in the moment. And so I say that to basically highlight the point that like the task of the Communist Party, isn't to recruit everyone, and it isn't to, I think that the example that you provided about the communists in the Philippines, where there's a group of Christian communists or Christians who are operating within this communist group, I see that makes sense to me, right? Whereas, for a Communist Party to explicitly like start speaking to, incorporating religions, incorporating arguments or lines from like religious communists, different religious communists to, sort of recruit makes like, that might make tactical sense in one area or another, but it doesn't make sort of like theoretical sense, But the thing is, again, is that like the party is like it's a malleable form. And in fact, the sort of founding document of like the Third International, right, the Comintern in 1919 or 1920, which is, that's the organization that really oversaw the formation of the communist parties that led all these struggles in the 20th century. It writes, this is 1921, and it's a document on communist organization that I just found in the nick of time, writes, there can be no absolutely correct, immutable organizational form for communist parties. The conditions of the proletarian class struggle are subject to changes in an unceasing process of transformation. The organization of the vanguard of the proletariat must also constantly seek appropriate forms corresponding to these changes. Similarly, the historically determined characteristics of each individual country condition particular forms of adaptations in the organization of the individual parties. And I really like that, because like that's a founding document of the organization, right, that helped form all these communist parties, saying that there's no immutable form for it. It can take different shapes. So to go back to the initial question, I can see it like sort of, making sense in particular moments. I think that the example of the communists in the Philippines, to me, that makes good sense.
Yeah, that's that it depends on the historical, like the material conditions is like the most communist thing you can say, I guess.
Yeah. When in doubt, just say that.
Yeah, right. that's like a good answer. There is like this. There's something. There's an interesting sort of like tension here. That like an interesting line that makes some tension with the sort of like flexibility or like do whatever is like works in the material conditions that you're in or whatever. That like the Communist Party can like take some different forms depending on the situation. But the Christian Church, however, like we think about that as being like that is like an immutable thing that has a proper and right organization, or at least like there are an array of proper and right organizations depending on your denomination. There's like this really cool line, or I don't know if it's cool, it's challenging, it's interesting, I don't know, from McCabe, where he says the Christian movement shattered itself at the Reformation by its involvement in the capitalist revolution. It's only now, with the end of the capitalist era, that those wounds are being healed, now that they are irrelevant. We must expect the involvement of Christians in the socialist revolution to be no less traumatic for churches. So this is a pretty wild sort of thing for like a Dominican guy to say, like someone who is Catholic, like someone who belongs to the like the one church that is actually right about everything. That there could be like if Christians are going to participate in socialist revolutions, there could be like more potential schismatic things to happen. But there's sort of like I don't know. It seems like there's, at least in this, what I get is that there will be traumatic transformations of the church if like Christians really buy into the idea of class warfare as well, and that like I don't know, maybe we shouldn't fetishize the form of church or as like a specific organizational structure too much, because it could all be overturned like it has in the past with different political economic revolutions. Dean, what do you think about that, man? Is that cool?
I think it's very cool. So one thing that Matt and I found when we were Googling some stuff about McCabe was a Catholic Answers forum, where the first question was like, is Herbert McCabe Orthodox? Like, a real life good Catholic in good standing? And all these people were like, absolutely not, because they're the reasons they didn't like it was I think he's like a fan of women's ordination, which they don't like, and also something else. But anyway, point being, there are loads of reactionary Catholics that do not like Herbert McCabe, but they're all wrong. So, the thing is, like, McCabe isn't, like, he never got excommunicated. Like, he's a part of the Catholic Church. Whether people like that or not, just like there are a ton of like very bad reactionaries that I don't like are part of the Catholic Church. So, I think he's actually right to say like a lot of those differences are kind of irrelevant right now, because they are like bourgeois problems, whether you decide to, believe in God this way or not, or go to a Latin mass or a vernacular mass or something, like these dumb kind of basically like materially kind of meaningless issues. So I don't know. I like what McCabe has to say, so obviously I want him to be a good Catholic because I also want to be a good Catholic.
When I was reading this McCabe and the way that he's trying to deal with, like how do you love everyone and like, your neighbor or whatever, who's a capitalist, and wage struggle against them at the same time. I was actually thinking, like, to me, I think of Althusser, and like structural Marxism is super helpful here, because it's like you're not actually like the struggle is really against capital. It's not really against capitalists. I mean, to the extent that like capitalists, like a capitalist is not just a capitalist. That's like to the extent that they like participate in capitalism, advance their, throw capital into circulation. And blah blah blah, they're capitalists, but like that's not, you're not like, it doesn't actually do much good generally to wage a struggle against that person. You're really trying to wage a struggle against the system. And so I don't know, I thought to me that was another thing that was like, I don't know, I felt that was like a helpful way sort of out of that contradiction or to manage that contradiction. Yeah,
that's sort of a hate the sin, love the sinner kind of approach to capitalism.
yeah. Love the player, hate the game.
Yeah,
most of the time. Yeah.
So one thing Derek, Matt, and I have been talking about since you've been gone is
you make it sound like I like deserted you.
No, well, you went away and now you're back. You know, back as the rotating guest host. This is like Whose Line Is It Anyway? And you're like the guest host that people like. So you know.
Okay. Yes.
I'm gonna regret that metaphor later, but for right now.
Yeah.
So anyway, we were talking about how Marxist-Leninism is a lot like Catholicism, and then there are so many issues on the left that are just like very hilariously analogous to Christian problems. Like, if you go on any Christian like forum on the internet, you'll just see hundreds and hundreds of very pedantic, seemingly pointless like questions about this or that theology or this or that soteriology or like goofy terms, and like none of them matter, but they matter so much to these people. And Matt had this very funny Twitter interaction with the DSA about Maoism, and it was like structurally the exact same phenomenon. And I was just laughing about it because I feel like Marxism, Leninism, and Catholicism are similar, and then they're like, listen, there's a difference of opinion, but also like there's a disciplined structure here, and this is what holds us together. And like if you're not in, like that's on you, man.
Yeah,
the conversation I was having, I don't know, it's probably not worth sharing, but I'll do it anyways. Some
I want to hear it.
Some DSA chapter tweeted like a quote from Mao, and it was like something pretty innocuous and like I don't know, it was good. I read it, I was like, yeah, that's cool. And then like a gazillion other DSA Twitter bros, they were like, excuse me, you cannot do that. You can't quote Mao on the internet. That seems wrong. And then
that seems wrong.
And then they were like. Then there's like this like increasingly pedantic discussion about like why that's wrong. It's like it was the point of like maximum confluence between Christian rhetoric and like leftist rhetoric at that point was like can you quote Mao without being a Maoist? And it's like can you be a Christian and also do this? And it's like, oh my god, it's like full circle. It's the same thing. A
lot of transferable skills.
Yeah, lots of transferable skills for sure. Anyway,
and like also the quoting of letters from people to people.
Right?
Like,
that's right.
Especially like Trotskyites are always like, oh, and like Trotsky's letter to his son in like 1928, like he said this thing, in like the closing paragraph, and that's like my refutation to you.
Right.
And Christians are always quoting St. Paul's letters, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, but excuse me, that one is actually not authored by him, and I think you need to really check yourself there about what your biblical theology. Yeah, it's like it's ridiculous and funny.
Yeah. So also another way in which there are a lot of good bridges to be built. Maybe like the Christians could actually help the left on this, because we've been dealing with this problem for like hundreds and hundreds of years of how to like completely splinter and hate everyone, but also like try really hard to still call yourself a Christian.
Yeah, and like wield a lot of power and land.
That's true.
Yeah. Well, it's getting close to the end of time, Derek. But I just wanted to say thanks for coming back again.
Yeah, man, it's so cool.
This was like super fun, and talking about Lenin and McCabe together is like a thing that I've been wanting to do for a long time. So thanks for that opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. I've never read McCabe or heard about him, and this was totally new for me. And to tell you the truth, I mean, I'm not like an expert on, Lenin and religion or Marxism and religion, so it's always fun to, to learn from you guys and to think about it and to be probed a little bit, to think more sharply.
All right, thanks again to Derek for being on the show and putting up with all of our nonsense. Thank you for listening to the Magnificast. How about that? So make sure you do all the things that we said at the beginning of the episode. Join the Paul Virilio reading group. Give us some money on Patreon. You can get the episodes early if you do that. That's a cool thing, if that's what you want in your life. And to play us out, here's the Illogical Spoon, Hoods Up, the Lowdown Technified Blues.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, soul's alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.